Hold on one second.
Okay.
So I'm pleased to introduce our discussant this evening, Raymond Lodato, who is an assistant instructional professor in the environmental and urban studies and public policy studies programs at the University of Chicago. Dr. Lodato received his PhD and AM degrees in political science from the University of Chicago and his BA in government and peace studies, magna cum laude from Manhattan College. He has developed and taught courses on the environment. Dr. Lodato also supervises student researchers on BA thesis, serves on university-wide committees, and acts as a faculty advisor to several student organizations. In 2012, Dr. Lodato was a Democratic candidate who sought election to the US House to represent the 1st Congressional District of Illinois. So welcome, Ray, and thank you.
Thank you, Dottie. Really appreciate the invitation, and thank you all for inviting me. I have to admit, when I first came in contact with this book, I was reading it out of sequence. And I noticed a lot of information about former President Obama. And when I started this work for the talk tonight, I said, what am I going to say about Axelrod himself? But fortunately, reading it sequentially, I found a lot more information about him. And I found it to be a really interesting read, a very deeply personal book, one that focuses a lot on his own very interesting life. And, so we'll get through some of that and then some questions that I had about the work itself. Axelrod comes from a middle-class family in New York, but not an entirely harmonious one. His parents divorced when he's young, and his relations with his mother are at best difficult. He gets along better with his father even after the divorce, but he's devastated by his father's suicide when he's attending college at the University of Chicago. By the way, the description of the institutional culture of the University of Chicago is familiar and apparently timeless. The adherence to the letter of strict rules, the insistence that the university is not for everyone, and the disdain for any kind of pursuit that's practical and non-academic seems to cover a wide range of years of the university. Axelrod finds his niche in journalism, first at the Hyde Park Herald and then the Chicago Tribune. I don't have any special insights into his tenure at the Herald, but they have an extensive online archive, and I'm sure his byline can be found on any number of articles on politics during his time there. At the Tribune, his desire to be a political reporter is fulfilled more quickly than he had imagined when he's assigned to the improbable mayoral candidacy of Jane Byrne, who went on to upset the Democratic machine and was elected mayor in 1979. Axelrod covers her tumultuous term in office and her defeat by Hyde Park Herald, Washington in 1983. Axelrod's dissatisfaction with the Tribune increases as it takes on a more corporate, profit-maximizing culture that doesn't allow for in-depth or lengthy investigative reporting. This sounds very familiar given the recent purchase of the Tribune by Alden Capital, which sparked a similar exodus from the paper this year of its more experienced journalists. So apparently this is not the first time this has happened to the Tribune. He takes on the role of strategist and then campaign manager for then Congressman Paul Simon, who was running for the US Senate in 1984. Simon was a liberal Democrat, but won election that year at the same time that Ronald Reagan was winning a landslide both in the country and in Illinois. And this gave Axelrod a deserved reputation for as being a winning strategist that helped establish his business. The book provides a good overview of how candidates become office holders through the work of their campaign strategists. Oftentimes we hear from politicians, but their focus is usually on themselves rather than the nitty-gritty of campaigns. So Axelrod's book is a welcome addition to that story. If anything, I think Axelrod downplays the extensive hours and efforts that campaigns take for their strategists and workers. People who work on campaigns put in a lot of hours. Campaigns in the US are unique among the world's democracies, both because of their length and because they're privately funded. Anyone who thinks of campaigns as being what happens in the months leading up to an election misses the lengthy preludes and planning that precede any election, I should say. We see Obama planning his 2000 congressional run in early 1999 and his 2004 Senate race in 2002. So most of the candidates who will run in 2022, next year, have already announced their candidacies. For example, Montana is going to get another congressional seat, and while they haven't drawn the lines of what that seat's going to look for, several candidates have already announced that they're going to be candidates whenever the district is drawn. So people are planning well in advance for that. Campaigns are 7-day-a-week affairs, almost right from the beginning, and of course at the higher levels, right from the beginning. Limited time off for anything related to personal matters. A campaign worker who gets a haircut can be celebrated by their coworkers, or they can be castigated by their bosses. How did you have time to do that when you could have been contacting voters instead? So my first activity on the day after elections has always been to do laundry, to try and re-enter into a regular life as soon as possible. He also portrays the devastating impact that bad diet can have on campaign workers. And it's only recently that campaigns have been providing health insurance coverage for full-time workers during the campaign itself. Strategists and consultants at Axelrod's level are often portrayed as cutthroat, amoral opportunists willing to work for anyone for a price. Anticipating that, Axelrod points out that he turned down many candidates, including Obama, for a number of reasons and a number of different races. And he's self-critical enough to acknowledge that he should have shunned others, including John Edwards in 2004. He turns down some presidential campaigns, oftentimes because of family considerations. These campaigns, Clinton in 1992, Gore in 2000 in particular, could have cemented his reputation and taken him on a different path in his life. But Axelrod chooses to stay close to his family despite his own ambition. He kind of breaks the cycle of dysfunction that his family had when he was growing up. So it's certainly an admirable trait. Axelrod is candid about candidates he worked for, including Edwards, who comes across as insincere and uninterested in the actual work of government. He calls John Kerry indecisive. He considers Rod Blagojevich shallow and only ambitious. And he sees Carol Moseley Braun as mercurial. After his work with Simon in 1984, Axelrod's role is messaging and strategy rather than campaign management. Michael asked me to address this. Campaign manager is in charge of all different departments of the campaign. In a presidential campaign, they decide which states get the most resources, where ad buys are placed. You'll note that we don't see very many presidential campaign ads in Illinois anymore because we're no longer considered a battleground state. The manager decides who's in charge of what departments. They do personnel hiring. They decide where the candidate goes on a daily basis. Where is the candidate going to land the plane that day? Axelrod's role, in contrast, is to decide what the campaign's message is going to be. For Obama, it was an end to the culture of partisanship and divisiveness that prevented Washington from getting anything done for the people of the United States. If you tire of hearing a candidate say the same thing over and over, it's because the campaign has decided on a certain message that they think will resonate with enough voters to win the election, and they want their candidate to be identified with that message. Well-run campaigns settle on a message, continue to deliver it at every opportunity, so that whenever you hear a certain phrase, you associate it with that candidate, hopefully positively. Sometimes Axelrod's so convinced of his messaging and has such a desire for it to be true that he convinces himself that his candidate is the person he wants them to be. He even says it on page 117. The best example of that is Richard M. Daley, whom Axelrod goes to work for after the death of Mayor Washington, who Axelrod had also worked for 2 years earlier. Axelrod states that he went to work for Daley because of the precarity of his daughter's health and the need for resources to sustain her, perfectly good and solid reasons. But then he creates an image of Daley that's far removed from the lived reality of Chicagoans. Daley was, he says, a force for reconciliation, unquote, and someone for whom, quote, love of city in 1989 meant rebuilding communities, not tearing it apart, and unquote. Daley had, he says, a patina of competence and strength, and in his role as state's attorney, Axelrod says that Daley fought gangs and drugs. He doesn't mention that under Daley's tenure as state's attorney, Amnesty International found that confessions were derived through torture in the 2nd Police District under Commander John Day. So the messaging doesn't go that far with Axelrod. Daley could heal Chicago, Axelrod says, although he acknowledges that Daley campaigned in Black wards, particularly to reassure whites. Despite no longer being in the candidate message business at the time of the writing, Axelrod spins the myth that Daley never said, "You want a white mayor who can sit down with everyone." Even though the remark was recorded, it's available on YouTube, and we can all hear him say it. Daley stating in that phrase the premise of his 1989 campaign, that only a white mayor can be accepted by both Black and white audiences, and he'll be that mayor. But Axelrod persists in saying that Daley was misquoted. He can't imagine that Daley, who grew up in Bridgeport when it was a bulwark of white backlash politics and witnessed his own father's patronage politics take on a decided racial edge after 1963, would make such a blatant appeal to racial politics. And he's more upset that a civic group criticized Daley for the remark than he is that Daley would say it. And maybe this is part of his, idealism, his being a believer in his candidates. He wants to believe the best of them in every instance. It's not, having said all that, it's not entirely clear that a memoir entitled Believer explains what its author really believes. For all of his love of politics and his commitment, it seems, to work with candidates from only one party, it's not clear what motivates Axelrod to do the work that he does. There are no particular policies that seem to drive his ambitions or his candidate choices. Doesn't mention that he's a fan of single-payer healthcare, for example, or nuclear disarmament, which was an issue early in his work, reparations, inequality, etc. He does mention that the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, while he was working for President Obama, had particular resonance for him because of the struggles his family had gone through while his daughter battled epilepsy. But it's not clear that the desire for a better healthcare system led him to work for any particular candidate at any time. When he begins to work for Obama, they find common ground on their desire for politicians to work together across the partisan divide. From 2004 through the 2008 election, they positioned Obama not only as a path-breaking candidate who would become the nation's first African-American president, but as a uniquely positioned person who could turn down the partisan heat and restore bipartisanship as a valuable tool for achieving common ends. Aside from particular issues, he states on page 216, people came to the Obama announcement in Springfield in February of 2007 because they were drawn there by hope, he says. The audacious idea that against the odds, we the people could push back against the bitter, atomizing politics of our time and join together as one American community. Obama wouldn't just bring a new face to the White House, but he would fundamentally change politics in the US. That lasted not very long. After he wins, Obama has to choose a team to help him govern, and he selects people with experience in and with the very system that he had been condemning. Axelrod says the crisis of the Great Recession caused him to choose insiders rather than what he calls creative outsiders, as his supporters might have reasonably expected given the campaign. Second, the problem with promising the end of partisanship as a consequence of electing Obama is that it required the other side to buy into it too. Okay, you can only have the collapse of partisanship when both sides agree to come together. When Republicans refused to act in a bipartisan fashion and intensified their partisanship, there wasn't really a plan B for Obama and the Democrats to bring about bipartisanship. Here, Axelrod says there was, quote, a fundamental tension between a campaign that promised to change Washington and a White House that had to deal with the town as we found it. This probably seemed very reasonable to Axelrod when he wrote it, but to the reader, it's kind of jarring. He spent over 100 pages telling us that Obama and his team were going to come in and change Washington, but when it's resistant to change, they accept it as it is and look to work within its parameters. Their goals of changing Washington fall by the wayside for the end of seeing what they can get done within the limitations they spent 2 years arguing were outdated and destructive for the people of the United States. Axelrod says that, quote, we weren't going to change Washington overnight, unquote, which is of course true, but their reluctance to make progress on that when they had the most leverage in the first months of the administration is curious. He later says, with regard to healthcare, that, quote, the idealistic promises of the campaign collided with the real politics necessary to get things done. So this leads Obama to make policy choices that also undermine his desire to make change. Axelrod goes into considerable detail about the compromises, I should say, that Obama had to make with bankers who treated him disrespectfully, despite the fact that he doesn't pursue prosecutions for the crimes they committed that led to the Great Recession. Axelrod defends Obama's decisions, saying that while prosecutions would have, quote, had strong populist appeal, unquote, they could have held back the recovery, not just for Wall Street, but for the whole country. What he misses is the message that was sent to average people who suffered from the mortgage crisis during the Great Recession. It meant to them that bankers and the 1% were untouchable, that their crimes could be excused because their institutions were, as we said at the time, too big to fail. Some economists argue that protecting home ownership would have helped the recovery immensely, much more so than protecting bonuses for Wall Street executives, those bonuses being paid by taxpayer relief funds. When bankers refused to open up credit markets despite the bailout from taxpayers, Obama's forced to give in to them again. This isn't politics, really, that the bankers are engaging in, but hostage taking. The bankers hold the key to getting the economy moving again, and they refuse to do so after they've received their bonuses and are assured that they won't suffer any consequences for the crisis. What Obama got in return was Wall Street's lobbying against his efforts to reform the financial services sector. Ultimately, what the later Obama and post-Obama years have demonstrated is that one-size-fits-all policy solutions don't address the worst of social problems and don't do so in an equitable way. What's necessary is that policy reforms are targeted so the problems and concerns of those who suffer the most greatly from a problem receive special attention and consideration. The housing crisis in 2008-2009 wiped out a linchpin of Black wealth in the US and greatly exacerbated the wealth gap. By focusing on what could get done within the parameters of the existing system, rather than insisting on policy reforms that would address those most affected by the crisis, Obama missed an opportunity to make transformative change. When the 2010 midterms come about, Axelrod acknowledged that their promise to change the political culture was, as he says, failing. And he said, we had accommodated and abetted the status quo. In the end, we know how this concludes. Okay, Obama wins a resounding re-election victory, serves a full 2 terms in the White House. He's succeeded by a person who couldn't be more opposite of him in every possible way, a person with no experience and no interest in public service or the public good, who works actively against the integration of a diverse population into the American whole, and who is solely focused on the interests of the wealthy, most particularly himself. So there are other intriguing parts of the story as well. Maybe this is a little bit insiderish, but I found it very interesting. In other narratives, other accounts of the Obama ascendancy, the typical narrative has been that Obama first begins to consider the presidential run in 2008 when he's approached by Harry Reid in early 2006, Harry Reid being the Senate Majority Leader at the time. However, Axelrod gives a much more extensive timeline that includes 5 major events in 2005 that really raised Obama's profile and made it possible that he would run in 2008. In 2005, remember, he's saying at the beginning, I'm not going to run, I'm going to stay out of this. I'm not going to be a candidate in 2008. He tells people he hires, this is crazy. All this talk is about 2008 is crazy. By the end of 2005, he's considering it. By 2006, he's given it a lot of thought. But he mentions, as I said, 5 major events in 2005. First, his popularity at fundraising events for Democrats across the country. Second, his involvement in efforts around Hurricane Katrina. Third, the nomination of John Roberts to the Supreme Court, where Obama took a leading role as a constitutional law scholar opposing the nomination. Fourth is the kind of collapse in Iraq that's occurring and the extension, the failures of the Iraq War, which are ongoing, which again, Obama had criticized in 2002. And the Florida Democratic Convention, where he gave a speech that outshone all the other candidates who showed up, candidates who were much more obvious and much further down the line in their own preparations for 2008. At each of these times, he raises his profile. And as the year progressed, he and his advisors are beginning to make decisions with the national political implications in mind, and not just thinking about what does this mean for you as a senator from Illinois? Can you use this to build up your support in Illinois or continue your support in Illinois or win re-election in 2010? No, they're starting to think about the national implications by that time. Also, and this is probably going to be blamed on the editor or publisher, a lot of the book seems to move in the direction as if all of Axelrod's life is leading to the Obama campaign. The first story in the book is about going to the rally for JFK in 1960. He relates it to the final Obama rally in 2012. He compares Robert Kennedy to Obama on pages 22 and 194. He sees Carol Moseley Braun's election as a precursor to Obama. And historically, many of those things are correct, but at the same time, I'm sure these were much more discrete events at the time for Axelrod than they are portrayed here. His ability to overcome a difficult childhood, heartbreaking challenges in his family life, to become a really successful practitioner of campaign messaging and one who had a major impact on electing politicians, who've had it in turn an impact on American life, makes this a really compelling story, I think, and one that I think that we benefit from greatly. And so that's much of what I have. If there are questions, I'm happy to field them.
All right. Ray, I have a couple of thoughts. For one thing, of course, we're Hyde Parkers,
Yes.
A lot of us, and there's something about the trajectory of Obama's presidency or his political career that strikes me as similar to Leon Dupre, both of whom were very liberal Democrats. They had a clear political agenda, and yet neither one achieved anything close to what they set out to do. I mean, that's my observation. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I think they're certainly both well-respected figures. Certainly both of them benefit from their residency in Hyde Park and the culture that Hyde Park provides for progressive candidates. Those are certainly very, very different trajectories, from Dupre's 20 years on the city council and Obama being president of the United States. So I think that it's a little bit hard to make the comparison on that level.
Yeah, I suppose my point was that they both had very high political objectives and largely failed. At least that's my observation, and maybe I'm dead wrong about that. But
no, I don't think so. I think that I think that both came up against systems that were very much oriented away from their beliefs and their values, and they faced the challenge of trying to overcome that. Very difficult to do.
He did pass the Affordable Care Law, which was a major achievement, I think.
Absolutely, sure.
And which has held up, by the way, over years. I personally have been impacted by that, so I owe Obama a great debt of gratitude for the.
Yeah, 20 million people got health insurance who hadn't been covered before. That's a signal achievement. It really is a major achievement.
I'm Jean Jenkins. As I wrote in the chat, do you think Obama has benefited from knowing what really didn't go well in I'm sorry, Biden has benefited from Obama's mistakes?
I think so. I think they're different people, for one thing, but I think so. I think that I think Biden has seen that he's less likely to trim his sails. I think to I think he's more willing to accommodate the fact that bigger, in some cases, is better in terms of his ambitions. So,
and I wonder if also if when we're looking back with hindsight, and maybe nobody knew the Republicans were quite that obstructive. You see my prejudices here. Maybe no one knew the Republicans were quite as repressive to, for doing things, that came up, maybe that came up mostly in the Obama administration.
We had never seen that kind of obstruction before.
Yeah.
We'd never seen that lack of bipartisanship. The fact that one party would just shut down in a way that's almost parliamentary, that we have very defined parties that don't ever vote for the other side.
Mm-hmm.
So we've moved in that direction, and I mean there was even a vote for a judge this afternoon, and there were no Republican votes for this person. A relatively non-controversial nominee. They're not going to, they have to have every Democrat voting for this person in order to get it passed. So it's a level of obstruction and partisanship that we had really not seen, maybe ever in the U.S.
And maybe the fact that Obama was Black was what let them get away with it when he first came in, and it seemed like such a winning strategy that they're carrying it on.
Yeah. Well, they think it's a winning strategy. We'll have to see.
So Ray, we have another question in the chat. From Roger Huff. Does Axelrod offer any rationale for not sending Obama around the country in 2010 midterms, especially not paying attention to what happened in state legislatures regarding redistricting?
He doesn't give any explanation there. In other places, well, he does actually. He does. At one point, he says toward the end of the book that Obama saw a difference between campaigning and policy, and that he didn't see the intersection of them at all, and that there was some intersection where he could have been out more among people and built support for his policies that way. But it was a fundamental distinction. I think even the president has mentioned that in his autobiography, that he thinks that he could have done a little better job on the politics of that. So I think that that's one of the lessons that they've learned.
Just a random comment. It was great to revisit the Washington campaigns and Eddie Radoliak and the 29 and all that stuff. I have a lot of memories of all the activities that were going on then, and this was wonderful. Wonderful to hear about it once again.
Yeah.
Also, another question.
All right,
oh, go ahead, Michael.
Go ahead. No, I was going to do the same thing. Go ahead, Dottie.
Okay. So another question for Ray. Do you interact with Axelrod during your political activities in Chicago? What are your personal observations about him?
I've met David a couple of times. Not sure he'd remember either one of them. I did one time put together a pilot study and received some funding from the Institute of Politics, but I work with Steve Edwards on that and not David. So I really haven't had very much interaction with him. So I don't know him personally well at all.
And then could you speak a bit more about your opinion of the second daily and Axelrod's opinions of him?
Well, Axelrod seems to be very favorable toward Daley. He sees him as a healer, of somebody who was focused on bringing the city together. He says he pulled the city back from the racial abyss, which I think is way overblown rhetoric. I'm not sure that was ever Daley's intention, and I'm not sure it happened at all. So it's very much, he's very much on message with the Daley, his assessment of Daley, I should say. He's still kind of spinning. He's still doing the messaging for people's perceptions of him in a way that he's willing to separate out and say some things about other people, even about Obama, where he says, you don't take, at one time he says, you don't take a punch well, and then realizes later that he's better at it than he thinks. But there's never that kind of criticism of Daley. Okay, there's never, he never drops and says, well, you could have done this better. He was a little impervious or imperious, I guess I should say. Never changes his tone about Daley. Daley is always somebody who brought the whole city together. I don't remember that way, but that's that's okay.
And
Also, could you speak to his impressions of Harold Washington, which in our book club, we spent a whole meeting on Harold Washington and his biographies and that. And I think David had a slightly different take on Harold Washington than we had perceived in our previous meeting.
Yeah, I don't remember what let me see if I can find my notes here. I don't remember exactly what he said about Harold Washington. I didn't find it to be anything much different than I've read elsewhere. I guess that's why it didn't jump out at me. Did you find something, Michael?
It was just that he seemed to see the lighter side of Harold Washington, which was a person with a great sense of humor, and to some degree, I suppose we saw that in our previous meetings, but they had always been fairly serious about Harold as, and maybe it was just the different perspective of a campaign strategist as opposed to people working for Harold or people deeply believing in his message. I think with David Axelrod, you have to take some of his opinions as business related or not necessarily deep personal convictions, but he was in the business.
I think Jackie can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think Axelrod's role as an advisor or a campaign person really is confined to 1987, and the rest of his observations are really as an individual, more so.
Yeah, that's exactly, that, oops, my camera won't come on. Here it is. That's exactly right. He did the 87 campaign, but that was his only real involvement with Harold other than being a commentator. So he was at the Tribune when we did the 83 campaign, or maybe he started at the Herald and then went to the Tribune during the 83 campaign, and then he came to work for us in 87, but that was it.
Yeah.
I need to comment a little bit. I knew Axelrod, Axelrod came from the 24th Ward. That's where he grew up there, trying to say. And so therefore his father, his relatives controlled the Black community at that time, the Black Ward. And so that's where he got his comeuppance. Regarding Dupre he was a believer. He had integrity. He was serious about politics in the terms where it helped people. Harold was in that same vein, same kind of person. Obama was much more political. In other words, he was less grounded in a philosophy than he was in how to win and how to go forward in politics. And I'm not saying that he didn't have integrity and he didn't do things that were right, but there's a difference between a true philosophy-based political leader than one who's a political operator.
Thank you.
It seems to me that the Axelrod's experience and innate qualities as a journalist translated so well to his becoming a political strategist, and then his going from doing the series on the mayoral campaign where he met Washington, and then later the election of Harold Washington, making the election of Obama, or laying the foundation. I don't know if you want to comment more on that sequence. And
well, I'm trying. This is a nut I've been trying to crack for quite a while. Obviously, the Washington campaign in 1983, which again Axelrod was not involved in, was transformative for politics in Chicago and in Illinois in general. The difference between how Mayor Washington did in Chicago versus how Obama did statewide, and then the difference in the years is significant, and I'm not sure it's comparable. I think the better contrast might be Carol Moseley Braun in 1992 and Obama in 2004. Carol wins with 37% of the primary vote in 92. It's a very split electorate. Obama gets 53% statewide, which is a huge number in a very hotly contested primary with at least two other viable candidates. So that transformation is really the one that really kind of bears looking at in a county by county basis, I think. And it's not to discount Mayor Washington's
Right.
victory at all.
right.
Well, what I found interesting was the I won't say necessarily the interaction, but the connection of all these different. Carol Moseley Braun, I mean, David Axelrod admitted that if she had run for the Senate again, Obama would never have done it. I mean, there was a real turning point in both Illinois and national politics.
Yeah, that's true.
And of course, to me, Carol Moseley Braun has always been a huge enigma in local and state and even national politics. Interesting personality. We had an opportunity to meet her at the Historical Society one day. Very gracious woman, but she had a big role to play in Obama's future that is not necessarily obvious now.
Yeah.
Wasn't that the case that she was thinking about running for president? Because that was one of
Yes.
the reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, she opted to run for president when, if she had run for Senate, Obama would not have. And so that was how that played out.
Yeah. Fascinating. I think this is Roberta's question about the comments about Rahm or Biden. There are some comments about Biden in there. The most interesting ones I thought were, and I've read numerous accounts of this, they all come to the same conclusion. The vice presidential search, where Biden spends 2 hours saying why he can be disciplined and talking when they're trying to vet the candidacy. That's one of my favorite stories. 2 hours almost uninterrupted in talking about how disciplined he can be in talking. But there are a couple of times that he runs afoul of the messaging and they have to call him in on that. But he also not only respects Obama right from the beginning, but grows in his respect for him throughout the presidential term. So that's interesting as well. There are a couple of times he pops up, but there's no systematic account of Biden in the book itself. There are a lot more comments about Rahm Emanuel. They worked much more closely together. He and Rahm. He deeply respects Rahm for his abilities as a fundraiser, his ability as a manager, his ability to keep people on track. Again, his perception of him is not just as candidate, as someone who he supported when he ran for Congress, when he ran for mayor, but also on a personal level. And given when the book was written, 2015, the trajectory of Rahm's political career changed significantly after that. So that's there's a lot of positive comments on Rahm in the book, but it doesn't address the latter part of his political career.
How does Axelrod stand out or stack up against other political strategists in your mind?
It seems like he has, I mean, I know there's probably a lot of candidates he, who he took on for business purposes, of course, but it seems like he has quite a bit of conscience about it, quite a bit of commitment to, a certain set of principles that are worthwhile and that don't cause him to take on every candidate. So I think that's interesting. One thing that's missing, and I don't want to sound snarky about this because it's really not, but a lot of these firms take on corporate clients as well, because political clients, because of the nature of the cycle and stuff like that, can't always pay the bills. So they take on some corporate clients too. It would have been interesting to know if his firm had done that, what corporate clients they'd taken on, whether that influenced how they did messaging for their candidates.
Interesting.
But I'm not saying that he did. I don't really know. So.
Yeah, well, I found that very interesting throughout the book is the fact that this is a deeply personal account by David Axelrod of his involvement over the years with multiple candidates. I didn't personally get a clear idea that he had, how could I say it, a straightforward trajectory as opposed to just an anecdotal accounting of what he went through during those years. Yeah, it was clear that he did have convictions about the kinds of candidates he was looking for, and he was always looking for candidates he supported. But as you pointed out, he was in business, so there had to be other things that he did as a businessman to keep the business going. And that part we didn't hear about in the book. And I also thought the book was so very heavily weighted towards the Obama years that it was less of a balanced overview of a political strategist than just a personal narrative of his life with Obama.
Yeah,
which was fascinating.
There was some discussion of other candidates. There would have been interesting to hear even more. He gives us about one candidate per cycle sometimes, one candidate per election cycle. I'm sure there were several more. So it would have been nice to even have a tally. This was a good year. We did 7 out of 10 or something like that. Just to know more about the business, know about how this occurs, know what other services the firm provided other than messaging, or if that was their main product. So it would have been interesting to know a little bit more about the business aspect itself, I think.
Yeah, I was surprised at reading the book on how much the medical condition of his daughter really affected what he did on a number of things, and how he relied on his wife so much for the support needed.
Yeah, it's very admirable that he at times he even turns down work because he doesn't feel that it's philosophically in line with what he wants to do, even though he probably needs it for her care. So interesting.
I thought it was quite interesting to get a good picture of how many people are involved in a campaign and how well they must get along if it's going to be a good campaign strategy. There are so many people involved, and I thought that was interesting to hear about how many are and how they work together. And when you think about different presidents over time, you can think about some who did not change people very often, like Obama, versus some who did change often.
Well, and you think about how disciplined they were too. I mean, they were there really weren't leaks of that type. People weren't sniping at each other through anonymous quotes in the press. We saw 4 years of that just recently. People constantly burnishing their image through anonymous quotes. But there really was a much more discipline, and I think that was not only the quality of the people that Obama hired, but it was also their dedication to him and what he was trying to do. So it was a very good, solid team overall.
We have another question in the chat from Carol, published in 2015. Don't you think this book would have been a very different book if it had been written after the election of Donald Trump?
I think so, and Trump makes an appearance or two in here, offering his assistance in capping the BP oil spill and then building tents. Because his will be very beautiful if he does it. So I don't remember him doing it when he did have the Oval Office himself, but yeah, it would have been a different book. Obama. Really stands in stark contrast to both his predecessor and his successor. I think there's a tendency to forget now, after the Trump era, how divided the country was during the Bush and Cheney era, how much the administration's efforts to engage in torture and other things, various spy activities on American citizens were all very corrosive to the public realm, and how Obama really promised a fresh start from that. And then, the fact that we went through 8 years without scandal, without, whatever we can say about policy, there was really a very clean administration. And then we have the Trump era, and we'll be fighting those, we'll be indicting people for the next 4 years, to get to the bottom of that. So he does stand in stark contrast to presidents on both sides of him. And in some ways,
right, and I think that.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that while Axelrod continually points out that this was a tumultuous and very challenging period in American history, looking at the administration that followed, we're saying to ourselves, this was a piece of cake, this was tame, this was very civil compared to what followed. At least that would be my impression.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear how they perceive themselves throughout the first term. They perceive themselves as much politically weaker than it appeared. I mean, it was they start the campaign in 2012 thinking that they're the underdog. They're concerned about the jobs numbers, which they should be, but any president should be. But that they won such a convincing victory in November of 2012 is a real tribute to how positively people thought about Obama, because I'd forgotten about the jobs numbers being so weak throughout the 4 years of his term, well, of the first term, I should say. I was going to say
right,
that.
And
go ahead.
I think we all forgot about the fact that during the 2008 election was, even though there is a passing reference to it in the book, the stock market was crashing. The economy was crashing. People were in total fear and shock and awe and whatever you want to call it, and yet the election went on, the campaigns went on, it was, and I had forgotten about that part of it. I remembered some of the high points of the Obama administration, but I had forgotten that the election actually went on during the stock market crash.
Yeah. Well, and really Obama's actions during the campaign solidify his victory, because he, presented as somebody who's, helping to manage the crisis, even though he's just a candidate. And McCain is saying, is going off on various, tangents about it. It really made people confident in his ability to lead the country.
Right. He also benefited from the fact that there was no incumbent.
Yeah.
So everybody could blame the Bush administration for the financial crisis, and whoever came in afterwards could take credit for the recovery. It's easy for us to say that nowadays, especially during the COVID crisis when the economy has been doing extremely well, as it ended up doing back in 2009. But
it did take a while, though. In 2009, it did take a while for it to come back. We were in a significant hole.
right, significantly longer than recent. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
In terms of,
All right.
I have a question. Again, I haven't read the book as yet, but did David Axelrod think Obama was a good administrator as president? That is to say, besides appointing good people, did he know how to manage the large bureaucracy to the advantage of the American people and also for the Democratic Party?
I think the impression I got from Axelrod was that Obama was a good administrator because he was prepared. He would really investigate an issue, and he was calm and thoughtful in his, and not irrational in his judgments, even when things came up that were that demanded somewhat of an immediate response. He was able to think clearly about what needed to be done, and that was a real advantage that he saw, and that he respected at the beginning and continued to respect as time went on. But I think that
and how he also handled crises that came up.
Yeah, that he was really willing to not be irrational or jump to any conclusions right away. But at the same time,
or impulsive.
It wasn't impulsive, but at the same time, he wasn't ineffective or wasting time. You know, he would get to the solution fairly quickly.
I don't know if you saw the Frontline program that was put on PBS 2 weeks ago about Afghanistan, and they really was not very complimentary to Obama during that there about him not making changes, and that some of the policies he did not help bring about a conclusion to the war.
I didn't see it, but it does come up here, you know, where Obama is urged to increase the level of troops, but he keeps saying to his advisors, you have to give me an end date.
Right.
You have to give me closure. You have to give me some time we're going to get out of this, or else you're just going to come back and ask for even more troops. So there is a sense where he's fighting against the establishment there to try and get some resolution to the war, some exit strategy to the war. So that's a source of some frustration, even among people he's appointed.
Right, and I thought that it was interesting that he was the one that pursued the Afghan war to the extent of completely ending the war in Iraq, because his objective was Osama bin Laden, which he eventually succeeded in taking down. But that was the whole point of his strategy in Iraq, was to hunt down bin Laden, and he was successful at that. He was. I'm not sure how his strategy in Iraq played out after that, because in fact bin Laden was in Pakistan. But
there is some in the post-mortem, some of them are saying killing bin Laden would have provided an excellent exit strategy for Afghanistan. It could have happened then, but it's impossible to know. My knowledge of it's not that great.
all right.
Judy, I don't know. Judy asks about whether they're in touch anymore. I don't know what connection there is. He did say that they weren't in contact during the much after he left the White House until he got back on the campaign. I don't know what the status of that relationship is, or what how often they're in contact on any.
Just
I don't know whether he was in the group of people who were invited and went to go to the birthday party, or invited and disinvited, or not invited at all. I don't know. I don't remember which category he fell in.
I think he was in the category of disinvited. I saw that.
I mean, clearly Biden and Obama had it appeared to have a great relationship.
Mhm.
I don't know if it seems like it would have extended beyond beyond Obama's administration, but it seems, I'm just wondering, from a personal perspective, the type of person, that Axelrod was, whether that was reflected in his relationships with people. So,
No.
yeah.
So far as Biden and Obama goes, there's a great book that you all may have read about ex-presidents and how whether they're in contact with each other, whether they're in contact with the person who's in the Oval Office, called the President's Club. And it looks at relationships starting with, I think, Hoover and Truman, and whether ex-presidents communicate with each other, how often they communicate. Some communicate much more than others. Some surprises. Nixon and Clinton were in regular contact during the first 2 years of Clinton's term. The book says that presidents found Jimmy Carter difficult to deal with because he kind of goes his own way. It's a very interesting book, and it would be interesting to see an update. Apparently there's not much to update because Trump wasn't in contact with foreign presidents when he was in office, but it'd be interesting to see who Biden relies on during his administration.
I have a question here. And I read the whole book. I skimmed some parts of it, but I read most of it. The Clintons play a very big role in this administration, and yet after the primary, Hillary is hardly ever mentioned, and Bill is sort of front and center. Now, maybe this is because David's focus was on the campaigns rather than the administration, but do you have a take on that?
I think Hillary was on Obama's mind a lot. And I think that's why he makes, he proposes her for Secretary of State relatively early on. He really is committed to that. I think he came up with a really bunch of solid reasons to have her as Secretary of State, including the fact that she is so well respected around the world. He's going to have to focus on the economy. So it'd be good to have somebody who the world respects out there in front when he can't be there. So I think there's a lot there. I don't know that there's much more to say in the second Obama term. Obviously, Hillary leaves the administration to prepare for her own run. But, I think there was a great deal of respect after the primary, after the feelings were overcome as to who was between the two of them.
Interesting relationship.
Kathy's asking about Axelrod's role or opinion of Obama's foreign policy. He spends a little bit of time on foreign policy, but not a whole heck of a lot. He mentions that he mentions their difficulty again in Afghanistan. He mentions the various trips they took, and that they're trying to create good relations with countries, especially countries where there hadn't been good relations in the Bush administration. He mentions trips to Egypt and Saudi Arabia, as well as he mentions President Medvedev in Russia and how he got along well with him, knowing, though, as we can see it, knowing that Putin is the strong man behind the throne, kind of makes it difficult to see that as being very consequential.
All right, do we have any other questions? Any other
I
discussion?
was going to ask, I didn't get to the last third or half of it. Did Axelrod mention anything about any opinion or any more topic to do with Hillary's, Obama approving Hillary's idea of going into, and why can't I think the name of the country?
Libya.
Where,
Libya.
pardon?
Libya.
Oh, yes, Libya.
I don't remember anything on Libya. I hope I didn't skip over it, but I did a pretty thorough read, but I don't remember much about Libya.
I mean, I don't think they talked much about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ray, in terms of political history, it seems important for this kind of documentation to take place.
Mhm.
I'm just imagining somebody like a Robert Caro years down the road will find some nugget of gold in there.
There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of his opinion on other people. His opinions on First Lady and on Valerie Jarrett aren't always positive. I think they took a couple of hits there, but it's an interesting read on the administration.
All right, well, I think unless we have any other questions, we want to thank Ray so much for joining us and providing his insights on this very interesting piece of political history that had a lot to do with Hyde Park. And thank you all for joining us and for your questions and participation. Ray, any final comments?
No, I mean, I would be very interested in reading more, about from political strategists to see more about how they do their work. That would be interesting. I had an interview at one time with a firm that's mentioned in the book, not Axelrod's, and the work seemed to be not the kind of work that I wanted to do at that time in my life. So it would be interesting to see how other people handle the work of campaigns.
Right. Well, this was my impression is that there were two distinct points of view. There was Axelrod's point of view, which is, yes, he had this focus on the message, and that was very important to him, but he was so invested in the process, so invested, so wedded to the thrill of the election, that was all encompassing for him. And I thought at some points in the book, he lost track of the objective, which Obama seemed to keep in mind all the time, which is, we're supposed to get things done here. We aren't just supposed to win election.
Right.
So I found that perspective very interesting, that Axelrod's viewpoint was largely on the process. And it was sort of by inference that we got the idea that his successful candidate, and several of them, were more focused on the outcome. So.
Well, but that was Axelrod's job to get them elected, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So
for sure.
And he didn't, while he could be really interested in the principles and the potential activities of the administration, he couldn't do anything much about it.
Yeah.
Except offer suggestions. I kept getting the impression that he just loved doing this campaigning, that he sort of fell into it, and it was so terrific that he couldn't stand it. Had to keep doing it.
I agree, Jean.
Just the way he talked about it. I mean, it's like, I've had wonderful jobs and awful jobs, and most of what he described about campaigning was that he felt it was a wonderful job, that it was just really rewarding and fascinating and all that kind of stuff. But he wasn't, it wasn't his job to make these candidates do something useful. He certainly did regret some of the candidates, like particularly John Edwards. I found that a very interesting passage. As if Edwards didn't really care about much of anything, and it was his wife who was so invested, and who knew, right? I didn't. I mean, it didn't surprise me when I read it. It wasn't like, didn't go counter to whatever impression I had of him before, but it was an interesting little piece.
But I think
Other thing, and this isn't Axelrod or anything, but I guess I keep going back to the 70s and 80s because that was really a fun time interesting time politically in Hyde Park. And I got to thinking about it. We had 4 major assassinations in the 70s. John Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. And I can't believe we all sort of survived it without freaking out. That's an astonishing thing to have happen.
It is.
And looking back on it, and then we had Nixon resigning, all that stuff happened. First it was, what's his name, Agnew resigning, and then Nixon resigning, and then Ford pardoning him, and there was a lot of tumult there. Not quite, not like the Trump years where, it was our representative who was embarrassing us all the time. Most of these were outside actors who didn't have anything to do with our system of government. But just that we persisted and thought that, it was all going to survive. I'm kind of amazed at that now that I think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the best thing about campaigns is that they have a very definite ending point. Unlike most things in life where there's ambiguity and you're never sure if you get it right. Election day, it's over.
Right. But that's, another thing, that's why I always like mathematics. I might not be right, but I knew there was a right answer. At least you get way higher than I ever got. But, writing a history essay or something, who knows,
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's, you do get confirmation as to whether what you did worked or not.
one of the questions I would like to ask David Axelrod and even you, that how the campaigns changed after Citizens United was passed.
Oh.
I think there's just a ton more money.
Yeah, with all the money how the campaigning really.
So much more money. Yep.
Does that mean more effectiveness?
No. It's a terrible way to run a democracy, really. Really funding campaigns is a terrible way.
There's so much money that they kind of inundate you with political ads on television, making you not want to, vote for anybody at all.
Yeah.
Because you're already angry, right?
Yeah.
Or at least that's how I react.
Yeah.
Ray, I heard on television today that some talking heads say that they were quite confident that Trump will run in 2024.
Yep, lucky us.
What's your thought?
Oh, I think he definitely will. Trump it's pretty much always about him, and if there's a way that he can extract, to put it very bluntly, money from his campaign, he'll do it.
And have adoring crowds.
You don't think he'll be in jail?
I don't know.
New York's going to go after him pretty strong.
I think people will be afraid. I think people will be afraid to put him in jail in a sense.
No, not New York.
Maybe not New York. Hooray for my growing up state then.
All right, well, we aren't going to decide the Trump thing tonight, so.
No.
Anyway, it was a pleasure to see you all again. And I'll just put one more plug in for the Hyde Park Historical Society. We would welcome any of you as members. You can go to hydeparkhistory.org to join on our website. And it's been, as I said, a pleasure having you all tonight. Thank you, Ray, for joining us and
thank you all for having me.
It's a very insightful presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you. I enjoyed being here, and I appreciate the invitation.
All right, and thank you, Dottie, for setting this up. And I guess at this point, we'll say goodnight to everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you
Good
for
night.
coming, and we'll send out the message for next month's meeting.
Good. See you
Thank
next
you.
month.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.